With the wastegates wired shut, Captain Magguy was forcing that engine to swallow twice the air and fuel it had been built to handle. The cylinder heads were glowing. The valves were beginning to stretch. Like taffy, the oil, meant to lubricate the moving parts, was thinning into a useless vapor that could no longer shield metal from friction. Maguire felt the tremor through the soles of his boots, a steady pounding that told him one of the 12 cylinders was beginning to misfire. He was at 22,000 feet, circling like a hawk above the 4 remaining Zeros. But his high perch was eroding. He had a decision to make. He could pull back the throttles, baby the wounded engine, and limp toward home. That would mean surrendering his altitude advantage and possibly allowing the Zeros to climb up and corner him. Or he could ignore the dying engine, squeeze every last ounce of power from it, and make one more crushing attack, break the enemy formation before his own aircraft broke apart. Magguy looked down. The Japanese fighters circled in a loose defensive pattern, waiting for him to descend. They resembled sharks circling a fatigued swimmer. Magguy shoved the throttles forward again. He chose violence. The P-38 answered, though the left side lagged. He rolled the heavy fighter inverted and pulled the nose down through the horizon into a vertical dive. This time he wasn't relying on gravity alone. He was using full war emergency power from the right engine to drag the aircraft downward. The airspeed indicator surged past 400 miles per hour. The air flowing over the wings became a solid wall, stiffening the controls until the yoke felt embedded in concrete. He was descending like a freight train with no brakes. The Japanese pilots saw him coming. They split apart in a defensive maneuver known as the starburst, each aircraft darting in a different direction. The tactic forced an attacker to select a single target while exposing himself to the others. But the Zeros were accustomed to fighting at 300 miles per hour. They were not prepared for a modified lightning screaming toward 500. Magguy didn't pursue the scattering planes blindly. He predicted them. He selected the Zero braking left and calculated its position 3 seconds ahead. He didn't attempt to turn tightly. He simply adjusted his dive angle, leading by an enormous margin. The closure rate was staggering. The Zero swelled from a speck into a full aircraft in an instant. The Japanese pilot realized too late that he could not turn inside the American's dive arc. He tried to pull upward into a loop, but Magguy was already positioned above him. He fired a short, decisive burst. The .50 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon converged on the Zero's engine cowling. The result was total. The aircraft didn't trail smoke. It disintegrated. The forward fuselage was torn away, the engine block ripped from the airframe by the sheer force of the shells. The remains spun downward like a beheaded bird into the jungle canopy. Magguy pulled hard on the stick to recover from the dive. The G-forces slammed into him, crushing him into the seat. His vision dimmed. The world narrowed into a gray tunnel. 6, maybe 7 Gs. The P-38's wings bent under strain, aluminum skin wrinkling, yet the structure held. He shot upward again, converting speed back into altitude, climbing toward the protective glare of the sun. He checked his mirror. The 3 surviving Zeros tried to follow, noses raised, engines straining, but they were futile. They were chasing a rocket with a kite. One by one, they stalled out below him. He leveled at 20,000 feet. 2 destroyed, 3 remaining. The moment of triumph ended abruptly. A violent shudder erupted from the left side. The engine didn't merely cough, it surged and then died. The oil pressure needle collapsed to 0. Manifold pressure fell away instantly. The reckless modification had finally demanded payment. The extreme heat had melted a piston, locking the engine solid. The propeller froze in the windstream like a windmill trapped in a storm. The immediate loss of power created a deadly aerodynamic condition. Asymmetric thrust. The right engine still roared at full output, delivering 1,600 horsepower. The left side was now nothing but dead weight. A massive air brake dragging that wing backward. The imbalance tried to roll the P-38 onto its back and spiral it toward the ground. Magguy reacted without thinking. He stomped hard on the right rudder pedal, countering the violent yaw trying to wrench the aircraft from the sky. He grabbed the mixture control for the dead engine and pulled it to idle cutoff. Then he pressed the feathering switch, rotating the propeller blade's edge on to the airflow to reduce drag. The aircraft bucked, then steadied. It was wounded but flying. He was now piloting a 20,000-pound fighter on a single engine. Under normal conditions, that would have meant certain death in combat. A single-engine Lightning was slow, sluggish, unable to climb, easy prey. The Japanese pilots below noticed the smoke trailing from his left nacelle. They saw the frozen propeller. They understood instantly. The beast was crippled. They abandoned caution and surged upward, throttles wide open, climbing aggressively. They sensed weakness. They believed the American would have to dive for the deck and crawl home at barely 200 miles per hour. But they didn't know about Sergeant Miller's handiwork. They didn't know the right engine had been modified too. Magguy glanced at the manifold pressure gauge for the right engine. It hovered around 45 inches. He knew he had one card left to play. He shoved the right throttle forward, snapping the safety wire, forcing the lone surviving engine past the red line. The turbocharger on the right boom wound up with a piercing whine that vibrated through the cockpit. The manifold pressure surged to 60 inches. That single engine was now generating almost the same power as two standard engines. The P-38 no longer behaved like a crippled aircraft. It lunged ahead. Magguy banked toward the closest Zero, climbing to intercept him. The Japanese pilot expected a sluggish, wounded opponent. Instead, he faced a one-eyed demon that was still accelerating. Magguy didn't dogfight. He didn't attempt to turn. He used the raw, unfiltered power of the single modified engine to fly straight through the enemy formation. He flashed past the lead Zero head-on, the closing speed so extreme that neither pilot managed to fire. The Japanese pilot rolled hard, trying to settle onto Magguy's tail, confident he could outturn the damaged American. But Magguy didn't turn. He ran. He held the nose steady and let the altered engine devour the air. The speed climbed 300, 320, 350. He was outrunning the Zeros on a single engine. According to both nations' manuals, it was impossible. The Zeros pushed to their limits, radial engines roaring, yet the gap widened. They pursued him for over a mile, firing distant bursts that fell well short. They couldn't comprehend it. They were chasing an aircraft dragging a dead propeller, and it was pulling away as though they stood still. Magguy glanced at his instruments. The right engine temperature crept toward danger. He was demanding that one block of cylinders perform the labor of two. He knew the strain couldn't last. He had to break their will. He spotted one Zero attempting to cut him off on a diagonal intercept. Bold, aggressive. The Japanese pilot aimed to head him off. Magguy waited until the Zero committed to its turn, exposing its underside. He dipped the right wing just slightly. He didn't need complex maneuvering. He only needed alignment. He led the turning aircraft, calculated the deflection, and squeezed the trigger. The tracers streamed outward, striking the Zero's wingtip. The fragile airframe tore apart. The wing folded inward, pitching the fighter into a violent snap roll. It didn't explode, but it was finished, spiraling helplessly toward the jungle. That was the breaking point. The remaining two Zeros saw their leader destroyed, another wingman spinning down, and the crippled American disappearing into the haze at 360 miles per hour. They understood they were fighting something unnatural. They disengaged. They turned back toward base, abandoning the sky to the smoking, battered Lightning. Magguy watched them diminish in his mirror. He eased the right throttle back, reducing manifold pressure from the suicidal 60 inches to a survivable 40. The engine ran rough, shaking violently, overheating, having likely melted its own spark plugs. But it still turned. He was alone in the sky. The cockpit was filled with heavy silence, broken only by the drone of one engine and the rush of wind. He was 100 miles from home. One engine dead. The other probably destroyed internally. He was losing altitude, converting height into distance, gliding toward the mountains that separated him from Maryland. He scanned his gauges. Hydraulic pressure was fading. Electrical systems flickered. The aircraft was dying around him, but it had accomplished its purpose. It had ignored the manual, defied the enemy, and bent the rules of physics long enough to win. He crossed the Owen Stanley Range, jagged peaks clawing at his underside. In the distance, he saw the airstrip, a brown scar carved into the green jungle. He keyed the radio, voice flat with exhaustion. He declared an emergency. He reported single engine, failing hydraulics, and an aircraft hot enough to fry an egg on the wing. The tower cleared the strip. Fire trucks rolled into position. Maguire lowered the landing gear. Without hydraulic power from the dead left engine, he used the emergency hand pump, cranking a lever to force the wheels down mechanically. The gear locked with a heavy thud. He aligned with the runway. There would be no go-around. One chance. He cut power on the right engine and let the lightning settle. It struck the dirt hard.
Bounced once, then dropped onto its wheels. He stood on the brakes, fighting the yaw, holding the aircraft straight through sheer instinct and strength. The P-38 rolled to a halt at the end of the strip. Steam poured from the right cowling. Oil leaked from the left. It looked like a wreck, paint blistered, gun ports blackened, yet it stood on its own landing gear. Maguire slid back the canopy and remained seated for a moment, listening to the ticking of cooling metal. He drew in a deep breath of humid, decaying jungle air. It tasted sweeter than any champagne he had known. He released his harness and climbed down onto the wing. Sergeant Miller was already there, having sprinted from the revetment with the rest of the ground crew close behind. The silence on the flight line felt heavier than the jungle air. Miller didn't ask if it had worked. He went straight to the right engine, the one that had carried them home. He snapped open the Zoo's fasteners and lifted the cowling panel. A cloud of acrid blue smoke billowed out, carrying the sharp scent of burnt oil and scorched metal. Burnt oil and melted rubber. Miller leaned closer and looked inside. What he saw would have made a factory engineer weep. The engine block had fused into a single useless mass of metal. Spark plug wires had melted into the valve covers. The turbocharger housing glowed a dull, furious cherry red. It wasn't an engine anymore. It was a paperweight. Miller straightened up and looked at his pilot, alive, standing on the wing. He wiped grease from his cheek with a rag, a grin breaking through the grime. He jabbed a thumb at the ruined engine and asked if the captain had any complaints about the tune-up. Mag-Guy looked at the mechanic who had saved his life with a wrench and a strand of wire. He shook his head. The only issue, he said, was that he ran out of zeros before he ran out of horsepower. The silence on the flight line at Marilinen Airfield was thick, heavier than the jungle humidity. Captain Thomas Maguire sat on the wing of his smoking P-38, his flight suit drenched in sweat, his hands trembling as the adrenaline drained away. The aircraft cooling beneath him no longer sounded like machinery, it sounded like something dying. Heat still radiated from the twin Allisons, warping the air above the wings in shimmering waves. A crowd gathered. Not just ground crew, but pilots, armorers, intelligence officers, men who had watched the battered fighter limp in on one engine. They studied the aircraft with a mixture of awe and disbelief. It looked as though it had flown through a furnace. The paint on the cowlings blistered and peeled. The aluminum skin had turned a sickly blue-gray, scorched by temperatures it had never been meant to endure. Master Sergeant Miller was the first to approach. He didn't ask if Maguire was all right. He went straight to the right engine, the one that had brought them home. He popped the Zoo's fasteners and lifted the cowling. Acrid blue smoke poured out, heavy with the stench of burnt oil and melted rubber. He stared inside. The sight would have broken a factory engineer's heart. The engine block was welded into a warped lump. Spark plug leads were fused to metal. The turbocharger casing glowed red as a dying coal. The engine had destroyed itself completely. Miller stepped back and looked at Maguire. He wasn't angry. He looked like a man who had watched his racehorse run until it collapsed at the finish line. He wiped his hands on a rag and nodded once. The machine had delivered exactly what they had asked of it. It had given everything. The commanding general of the 5th Air Force Fighter Wing did not share that view. He arrived minutes later in a jeep, bouncing across the steel planking of the runway. He jumped out before the vehicle fully stopped. He was a man of logistics, of supply. Sheets and asset columns. To him, AP-38 was a $100,000 investment belonging to the American taxpayer. He saw an aircraft deliberately destroyed. Engines abused beyond reason. He marched to the wing, face flushed with fury, demanding to know why his fighter had been turned into scrap. He accused Maguire of recklessness. He accused the crew chief of incompetence. He gestured at the melted engines and declared it a court-martial offense. Maguire didn't argue. He didn't lecture about thermodynamics or describe the chaos of 5 diving Zeros. He stepped down from the wing and walked to the nose of the aircraft. He opened the gun bay panel and removed the gun camera cassette. This was the silent witness. Every time the guns fired, a camera in the nose recorded exactly what the pilot saw. He handed the canister to the intelligence officer and told him to develop it immediately. He told the general the explanation for the ruined engines was on that film, and if it didn't justify the cost, he would accept the court-martial. An hour later, the command tent was dark, lit only by the flicker of a projector. The general sat in the front row, arms folded, prepared to see proof of disaster. The film rolled. Grainy black and white images shook with engine vibration. The first sequence showed the silver Dina, no distant speck, but filling the frame. The general leaned forward. He knew the Dina flew at 30,000 feet. He knew American fighters couldn't catch it. Yet there it was, centered in the crosshairs. Tracers flashed. The Japanese reconnaissance aircraft disintegrated. The tent remained silent. The general understood physics. For a P-38 to overtake a Dina, it had to be flying dangerously fast. Then came the Zeros. The footage lurched as the camera cut and resumed. The horizon tilted 90 degrees as Maguire pulled vertical. The sky spun. The Zeros were not diving on him, they were stalling below. The P-38 rolled over the top and plunged back down. The lead Zero shattered into fragments. Another spun helplessly toward the jungle. On the screen, the lightning moved like a rocket. It climbed like an interceptor. It dove like a weight dropped from the sky. It performed maneuvers the manual insisted would destroy the aircraft. And yet, it flew. Pilot. When the film rattled to its end, the lights came back on. The general remained seated for a long moment. He stared at the screen, then turned his gaze to Maguire. He understood that the equation had changed. He could order a new engine from a factory in Detroit for $10,000 and have it shipped to New Guinea within a week. But he couldn't manufacture a pilot like Maguire. He couldn't purchase a victory like that at any price. The destruction of the Dina meant the Japanese would not map Allied positions the next morning. The loss of the Zeros meant 5 enemy pilots would not return to kill Americans. Compared to that, 2 ruined Allison engines were a bargain. The general stood up. He tossed the court-martial recommendation into the trash. He instructed Miller to have 2 fresh engines installed by morning. Then he told Maguire to get some rest, because he expected him to do it again tomorrow. The hot rod modification did not remain secret. Word of the interception raced across the Pacific like wildfire. Every P-38 mechanic from New Guinea to the Philippines began examining their wastegates with pliers in hand. Officially, the manual never changed. The Army Air Corps moved too slowly for that. But the unofficial rulebook shifted overnight. Pilots discovered that the red line wasn't a wall, it was a fence. They learned that in emergencies, the machine could be pushed beyond its limits and still survive. The Miller modification became legend in the hangars. For top aces, it became routine to tune engines for maximum aggression, knowing they might burn them out within weeks, but they would live through those weeks. Captain Thomas Maguire went on to become one of the greatest aces in American history. He finished the war with 38 confirmed victories, second only to Richard Bong. He flew the P-38 to the very end. In January 1945, he was killed, not by engine failure, but by stalling at low altitude while trying to save a wingman. He died the way he lived, fighting. His legacy wasn't just a score tally. It was an attitude. He proved that a machine is only as capable as the will of the person operating it. He showed that rules are written for ordinary days, not desperate ones. We tell this story because innovation doesn't always originate in a laboratory. Sometimes it begins on a muddy jungle airstrip. It grows out of desperation. It comes from a mechanic staring at a flawless machine and deciding he can improve it by breaking it. Engineers designed the P-38 to endure. Soldiers modified it to win. That difference is profound. One philosophy is about preservation. The other is about survival. So the next time you are told something is impossible, or that you are pushing too far, or that you are going to break the system, remember 30,000 feet. Remember the Silverdina and the 5 zeros. Remember the manifold pressure needle buried in the red. Remember that sometimes the only way to catch the uncatchable is to wire the safety valve shut and let the engine scream. You might break the machine. You might melt the pistons. But you will win the fight. And in the end, victory is the only thing that doesn't rust. If this story revved your engines, if you could smell the burning oil and feel the cockpit shake, do us a favor and hit that like button. It helps the algorithm connect this channel with people who love the mechanics of history. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the overlooked stories of the war. And leave a comment below. Tell us the most extreme field modification you've ever heard of. We read every single one. We want to know what stories you'd like next. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting the channel. And we'll see you in the next one.